In the final quiet months before the world sank fully into chaos, the skies above America were strangely empty. Factories hummed, but only faintly. The nation moved with a steady rhythm of routine, morning papers, coffee in tin cups, engines idling outside modest homes, never imagining how quickly the world would demand more of them. It was a country suspended between decades, one foot still stuck in the dust of the Great Depression, the other hesitantly testing the ground of an uncertain future. Across the Atlantic, however, the storm had already broken. Europe burned with a furious light, nations falling one by one beneath the crushing machinery of a rising empire. German tanks rolled across borders with an almost mechanical inevitability. Factories in the Reich roared day and night, producing weapons with a precision and speed the world had rarely witnessed. The Luftwaffe dominated the sky, its shadow stretching farther each month. And among German commanders a belief grew, one carved from victory, steel and arrogance, that no nation on earth could rival their industrial focus. Least of all America. Yet it would not be a threat that awakened the sleeping giant. Not a bombing, not an invasion, not a desperate plea from an ally. It began with something far smaller, quieter, almost trivial. A remark. A sentence. A moment of unguarded confidence spoken behind closed doors. A German official, reviewing American production reports, reportedly smirked and dismissed the United States with a single cutting line. The Americans? They can't build. They are a nation of amateurs. It was not shouted in a rally, not inscribed in propaganda. It was simply said. Yet it carried the weight of a gauntlet thrown across an ocean. Perhaps it was the tone. Perhaps it was the timing. Perhaps it was the subtle cruelty of underestimation. But history often turns not on grand speeches, but on quiet insults whispered by powerful men. In Washington, the remark reached ears that were already uneasy. The world was shifting. Allies were falling. The brittle scaffolding of global peace trembled. The United States had been hesitant, unsure of its place in a new kind of war. But the insult, condescending, smug, dismissive, cut deeper than the Germans intended. Underestimation can be a dangerous spark. And for America, that spark landed on a bed of dry, restless ambition. Something stirred. Not loudly at first. It began in hushed conversations in government corridors, in late-night meetings in windowless rooms, in the restless silence of industrial leaders who had long dreamed of proving what American factories were truly capable of. Even on the factory floors, among workers who kept their heads down and their hours long, something shifted in the air. A sense of challenge. The insult did not ignite pride, it awakened resolve. Because beneath the surface, America possessed something Germany had overlooked. Not yet visible in numbers or blueprints. Not yet roaring in steel or smoke. But alive, waiting. Capacity. Ingenuity. Oh, and now, purpose. There is a strange, almost poetic irony in the fact that an empire at the height of its confidence would misread a country at the height of its restraint. Germany, victorious and confident, saw America as soft, distracted, incapable of industrial ruthlessness. They looked at the Great Depression scars and saw weakness. They looked at American factories and saw inefficiency. They looked at American workers and saw inexperience. They did not see what lay beneath. A culture forged in reinvention, a workforce hardened by economic survival, and an industrial landscape capable of transformation on a scale no nation had ever attempted. But at that moment in 1940, this future was invisible to most. The skies were still empty. The factories still quiet. The insult still nothing more than a whisper. Yet whispers can travel far. Whispers can reach the right rooms. Whispers can move nations. Perhaps, in the end, this was how it had to begin, a small echo that awakened something enormous. As Europe descended deeper into war, the United States found itself standing at a crossroads between isolation and responsibility. The nation was not eager to fight another world war, not after the wounds of the first one had barely healed. Yet the world was shifting. The balance of power was tipping. And while politicians debated, soldiers trained, and citizens hoped for peace, the factories waited, as if holding their breath. Steel sat unused. Assembly lines idled. Raw materials gathered dust. America, unknowingly, possessed a vast industrial reservoir, untapped, massive, and sleeping. And soon, the world would discover what happens when a sleeping giant, once mocked, once underestimated, finally opens its eyes. But to understand the magnitude of what would follow, the rise of an industrial force capable of creating 50,000 planes in a single year, we must step back. We must walk through the quiet towns, the sprawling factories, the long roads and rail lines that would soon carry engines, wings, and steel across the nation. We must understand the land, the people, and the mood of this moment. In early 1940, the United States was a place of contradictions. The economic recovery was real yet fragile. Unemployment had fallen, yet fear lingered beneath the surface. Mission statements were written cautiously. CEOs balanced ledgers with trembling hands. Families spent carefully, uncertain what tomorrow might bring. The nation's soul carried both hope and exhaustion, resilience yet fragility. But it carried something else too. Something harder to see. Something Germany missed. A restless hunger to rise again. Walk through the industrial districts of Detroit. Smell the oil in the air. Hear the metallic ringing of half-filled factories. See the workers, mechanics, engineers, technicians, arriving before dawn. Their movements slow, deliberate, seasoned by years of scraping through the depression. Men who fixed their own tools at home because they couldn't afford replacements. Women who managed households with the discipline of engineers. Families whose survival had depended on ingenuity, improvisation, and an unbreakable work ethic. These were not amateurs. These were survivors. And they were ready, perhaps unknowingly, for something bigger. Across the country, trains rumbled across long rails through plains and mountains, carrying coal, iron, lumber, and hope. The hum of commerce, though quiet, had returned. In cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and St. Louis, the heartbeat of American industry pulsed faintly but steadily. Jobs had returned, though slowly. Factories employed thousands, though not yet at full capacity. The nation was like a great machine warming itself after years of cold. In small towns, the rhythms were different but the sentiment similar. People read newspapers with headlines from Europe, falling nations, bombing raids, declarations of war. Some felt protected by the ocean. Others felt uneasily connected to what seemed distant but dangerously familiar. At kitchen tables, families spoke in cautious tones about what the future might demand. No one truly believed the war would reach American shores, not yet, but everyone sensed that the world was shifting in ways that could not be ignored. And in the midst of this uncertainty, the insults spread, quietly, subtly, carried in newspapers, whispered in factories, repeated in military briefings. It wasn't the only comment, nor the harshest, but something about it, the tone of dismissal, cut deeper. It awakened something old and powerful within the American identity, the instinct to prove, to build, to exceed expectations. Across the Atlantic, German factories ran at full capacity, their smokestacks rising like black pillars, their engines roaring with confidence. Workers moved in disciplined lines, producing weapons with efficiency and speed. German commanders studied maps with certainty, believing their enemies outmatched and outclassed. They saw America as a land of luxury, not labor. A place of entertainment, not engineering. A country too slow, too fractured, too untested. They believed the United States lacked the discipline, the urgency, the drive to produce at wartime levels. They believed the American spirit had softened. They believed a nation shaped by abundance could not master scarcity. They believed a country that idolized comfort could never summon sacrifice. They believed the insult because they wanted to believe it. And this blindness, this hubris, would mark the beginning of their greatest miscalculation. For behind every quiet American town, behind every half-lit factory window, behind every worker with grease on their hands, A storm of potential gathered. Steel waited. Oil waited. Machinery waited. Millions of workers waited. And when awakened, fully, fiercely, relentlessly, they would not merely answer the insult. They would drown it in steel and sky. This is the story of how a single insult helped ignite one of the greatest industrial transformations in human history. A story of pride and underestimation, of factories in flight, of a nation that discovered what it could become when challenged. But we are still at the beginning. At the quiet edge of a storm. Before the engines roar. Before the skies darken with wings. Before the numbers ascend into the unimaginable. To understand how America built 50,000 planes in a single year, we must first descend into the silence that came before it, the fragile world still unaware of what it was about to become. And so, the story begins, in the quiet before America awakened. In the months that followed the quiet insult, the world shifted faster than anyone had predicted. Europe fell deeper under the shadow of German ambition. Cities that once echoed with ordinary life now trembled beneath sirens and shattering glass. The Luftwaffe, confident and disciplined, swept across the skies with an ease that frightened even those who claimed to admire German efficiency. Nations that had stood secure for centuries collapsed in a matter of weeks. The speed of conquest was unprecedented, almost unbelievable. In Berlin, military planners reviewed charts and production reports with an air of certainty. German factories were running at full tilt, their output rising month after month. The Reich had built its war machine on the promise of absolute control of labor, control of material, control of time. Nothing was wasted. Every worker, every machine, every resource was part of a meticulously crafted system designed to produce dominance. Against this vision, America seemed unthreatening. Too slow. Too democratic. Too fragmented. The belief was not without precedent. In the early months of 1940, American production appeared almost leisurely. Aircraft manufacturing lagged far behind Germany's. American factories still produced cars in greater numbers than aircraft. Assembly lines lacked urgency. Military orders were debated for months, delayed by politics, restrained by budgets. To German eyes, the United States seemed incapable of the relentless discipline required for total war. Yet beneath this surface, strange currents began to move. In quiet government buildings across Washington, reports began to pile up. Reports from Europe, from embassies, from journalists, from spies. They painted a picture of a world collapsing faster than America was reacting. One by one, the warnings grew sharper. One by one, voices inside the government argued that the United States could not remain idle. One by one, the doubts faded. Still, mobilization on the scale required seemed impossible, until the insult arrived. In a peculiar way, it simplified everything. It turned debates into commitments. It turned hesitation into resolve. It turned political disagreements into a shared direction. The comment stung American leaders not because it was cruel, but because it was dismissive. Nations can endure threats. They can even endure fear. But being mocked, being written off, awakened something more primal. Americans were not accustomed to being underestimated. So the quiet reorganization of the nation began, piece by piece, industry by industry, leader by leader. To understand how America transformed so quickly, one must step inside the industrial heart of the nation as it existed in 1940. The United States had the largest manufacturing base in the world, but it was not yet aligned toward war. Factories were scattered, uncoordinated, and focused on consumer goods. Assembly lines were optimized for peacetime production. Cars, radios, refrigerators, engines for civilian life. But the potential was enormous. Take the automobile industry for example. In Detroit alone, factories stretched over miles of steel beams and concrete floors. The sound of rotary presses, stamping machines, conveyor belts, and welding torches created a low industrial hum across entire neighborhoods. Skilled workers filled these buildings. Engineers who understood machines intuitively, machinists who could carve precision parts from blocks of steel, men and women who had kept America moving even in the darkest days of the Depression. Yet these workers had never been asked to build planes. Not yet. When Washington began calling on industrial leaders, the conversations were hesitant at first. Could automobile factories be converted into aircraft plants? Could car-making engineers learn aeronautics? Could stamping machines forged for fenders be adapted to shape aircraft wings? Could supply chains handle aluminum instead of steel? The question seemed overwhelming. But in American boardrooms, in Detroit, Chicago, Seattle, Buffalo, and Los Angeles, something unexpected happened. Instead of resisting, the industrial leaders leaned forward. Henry Ford's executives ran calculations. Douglas aircraft engineers drafted conversion plans. General Motors directors began mapping supply routes. Boeing's designers imagined assembly lines larger than anything they had attempted before. The German insult had awakened a unified instinct: prove them wrong. Still, the real transformation began not in the boardrooms, but on the factory floors, among the workers who would soon become the backbone of the greatest industrial surge in human history. Imagine a Detroit factory in mid-1940. The air smells of hot oil and cooling metal. Conveyor belts clatter. Sparks fly from welding torches, lighting up the dim corners of vast, cavernous spaces. Workers move with practiced rhythm, each gesture ingrained by years of repetition. They are men who know machines by touch, by sound, by instinct. They are women who manage precision with almost surgical control. They are immigrants, second-generation Americans, people from farms and cities, from north and south, all drawn by the promise of steady work. When news spreads that the factory might shift to aircraft production, reactions vary. Some feel excitement. Others feel dread. Many feel uncertainty. They have never built planes. They have never worked with aluminum alloys or aeronautical rivets. They have never assembled engines meant to fly thousands of feet above the earth. But beneath the apprehension lies a quiet determination. If they were being underestimated, they would not remain so for long. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Germany continued its rapid advance. From the fall of Poland to the collapse of France, the Reich experienced victory after victory. The Luftwaffe's efficiency became legendary. In military briefings, German commanders spoke confidently about American production. They saw no threat. They dismissed American workers as undisciplined. They believed that democracy, messy, argumentative, and slow, could never mobilize with the unity of a dictatorship. They had forgotten something essential: democracies move slowly, until they move. And when they do, they move with the full weight of their people. By late 1940, Roosevelt's administration began pushing for massive industrial coordination. The arsenal of democracy speech would soon follow, but before the words were spoken, the machinery was already shifting. Government teams visited factories in secret, assessing capacity, cataloging equipment, and estimating conversion costs. Engineers quietly studied German aircraft models, comparing them with American prototypes. The early numbers were sobering. Germany produced far more aircraft per month than the United States. Yet a strange confidence grew among American officials. Not because they were ready, but because they knew what could happen once they were. Blueprints began to multiply. Factories began to reorganize. Training programs were drafted. Universities partnered with aircraft engineers. Supply routes were mapped across the continent. The railroads that would move engines from the Midwest, the ships that would carry aluminum from the coasts, the trucks that would deliver parts to assembly lines across the nation. Meanwhile, American newspapers began quietly reporting on German attitudes. Headlines referencing the insult appeared sporadically, usually framed as a speculation, a whisper, an unconfirmed remark. Yet the reaction was consistent. Americans bristled. Not in anger. In focus. There is a certain kind of calm that descends upon people who have something to prove. The quiet sharpening of purpose. The stillness before action. The feeling of gears beginning to lock into place. Factories that had once hesitated now moved faster. Workers who had once doubted now trained harder. Engineers who had once argued now collaborated. It was as though the nation realized, collectively, almost instinctively, that it had been seen as something less than it truly was. But even with this rising determination, the scale of transformation required was almost unimaginable. America would need not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands of aircraft. Fighters, bombers, transport planes, trainers, an entire air armada built from scratch. The Luftwaffe had been preparing for years. America had only months to start. To catch up, the United States would need to convert automobile plants into aircraft factories capable of producing engines, fuselages, wings, and weapons at a pace the world had never seen. It would need to create new industrial techniques, new designs, new infrastructure. It would need to build entire cities of workers, cities that operated 24 hours a day, fueled by coffee, sweat, determination, and the hum of machinery. And it would need to do it under pressure so intense that failure would be felt across the world. Yet as winter approached in late 1940, the momentum accelerated. Contracts were signed. Assemblies were prototyped. Steel was ordered. Aluminum supplies were secured. Workers were recruited. The hum of factories grew louder, steadier, deeper. It was still only a murmur compared to what would come, but the direction was clear. The United States was beginning to transform. Then, quietly, without ceremony, the first wave of new American aircraft orders appeared. Small numbers at first, prototypes and experimental runs. Factories tested new assembly lines. Engineers worked late into the night. Mistakes were made, corrected, learned from. Shelves filled with blueprints. Foremen paced factory floors with clipboards in hand. The rhythm of the transformation quickened. And still Germany dismissed it all. Even as American newspapers began speaking cautiously of rearmament, even as American workers left their homes before dawn to take new training courses, even as factories expanded their operations, even as Washington spoke increasingly about industrial mobilization, Germany remained convinced that America lacked the discipline for war. It was a fatal assumption. For while Germany relied on a rigid, top-down system, America embraced something far more adaptable: creativity. Engineers experimented constantly. Workers suggested improvements. Factories redesigned processes week by week. Assembly lines were modified overnight. Competition between companies accelerated innovation. Mistakes were not punished, they were corrected and learned from. This flexibility, this constant evolution, this restless drive to improve, it would prove decisive. By early 1941, America's industrial awakening had become undeniable. The numbers were still small compared to Germany's output, but they were rising fast, far faster than expected. American factories were changing, almost mutating into something new. The speed at which they adapted startled even the government officials overseeing the process. Germany, however, saw only the current numbers, not the trajectory. They saw America producing hundreds of aircraft while Germany produced thousands. They saw present-day data and drew conclusions as though the future would resemble the past. But the future belonged to momentum. And America's momentum was now unstoppable. The insult had become a catalyst. The industrial heartbeat of the nation had grown stronger, quicker, more unified. Though the skies above America were still relatively empty, the factories below were filling with energy. And soon, very soon, the transformation would leap from blueprints to reality, from steel to flight, from potential to mastery. The world did not yet know it, but the greatest industrial surge in modern history had already begun. As 1941 unfolded, the transformation of American industry could no longer be dismissed as political rhetoric or wishful ambition. Something far more profound was happening beneath the surface of the nation. The shift was not only mechanical, not only economic, not only strategic. It was human. Factory floors, once noisy but manageable workplaces, were becoming worlds unto themselves. Cities that had slumbered through the slower rhythms of the Depression suddenly pulsed with relentless energy. Entire neighborhoods woke before sunrise to the clang of machinery. Streets filled with workers wearing dark coats, lunch pails in hand, boots echoing against cold pavement. Inside the factories, the air was different now. Hotter. Heavier. Charged. The smell of melting aluminum mixed with machine oil. Sparks from welding torches flashed like tiny explosions beneath high steel rafters. Engines roared during testing cycles. Rivet guns hammered with a staccato rhythm that shook the bones. Conveyor belts rattled and hummed, carrying pieces of aircraft, wings, fuselages, engines, past rows of focused workers. The pace was unlike anything America had known before. And at the center of it all were the hands, millions of hands, that would shape the future of the war. Some belonged to men who had worked in the automobile industry for decades. Their palms were calloused, their fingers marked by old burns and cuts. They carried the quiet confidence of people who understood machinery instinctively. They had grown up with engines, with steel, with metal that bent and responded according to their touch. Others were young men, boys really barely out of high school. They learned quickly, hungry for purpose, determined to prove themselves. They memorized blueprints, studied diagrams, watched foremen demonstrate precision tasks with near reverence. Their hands shook at first, and used to such responsibility but steadied with time. And then there were the women. For the first time in American industrial history, women entered factories in numbers the nation had never witnessed. They tied their hair back in scarves, stepped into heavy work boots, and took their places along the lines. Many had never worked industrial jobs before. Some came from farms, others from offices, others from homes where they had raised children and kept families afloat during years of poverty. But when they stood before the machines, riveters, presses, welders, they discovered something powerful. They were not only capable, they excelled. Their precision was unmatched. Their focus unwavering. Their endurance astonishing. They riveted the skins of aircraft wings. They assembled cockpit controls. They welded engine mounts. They checked instruments with meticulous attention. The world would later celebrate them under names like Rosie the Riveter, but in these early months they were simply workers, determined, proud, quietly fierce. In factory cafeterias, conversations shifted from worry to purpose. People spoke of orders, deadlines, quotas. They discussed new techniques, new machinery, new rumors about production targets. The German insult, passed around through newspapers, editorials, and word of mouth, echoed in subtle ways. You hear what they said? That we can't build. Amateurs, they called us. Well, let's show them. It became a quiet mantra, never shouted, never formalized, but felt everywhere. It threaded itself into the culture of the factory floors. It became an invisible force that pushed workers to stay late, to refine their techniques, to solve problems that had once seemed insurmountable. There is a particular kind of motivation that emerges when people feel underestimated. It is deeper than pride, stronger than fear, more persistent than anger. It is the desire to reveal one's true capacity, to oneself as much as to others. That spirit ran through every worker, every engineer, every foreman. But the transformation of America's aircraft production was not only happening in factories. It unfolded in classrooms, laboratories, and engineering workshops across the nation. In universities, professors who once taught theoretical physics now lectured on aerodynamics to rooms packed with young men and women eager to join the effort. Engineering students took on new urgency. They studied late into the night, diagrams spread across desks, slide rules clicking, pencils smudging paper with frantic scribbles. In research labs, scientists experimented with new alloys, new engine designs, new aerodynamic shapes. The air smelled of rubber, solder, ink, and chemical compounds. Test engines shook the walls, rattling equipment. White-coated researchers scribbled notes while watching prototypes spin under stress tests. In design rooms, aircraft engineers worked under pressure so intense it bordered on the unbearable. Maps, blueprints, diagrams and calculations covered every surface. Ashtrays overflowed. Coffee cups accumulated. Sleep was a luxury. Every line drawn on paper had to account for speed, lift, drag, strength, weight, variables that could determine life or death in the skies. They worked not only for innovation but for necessity. If America could not outbuild Germany, it could not outfight them. The tension extended into American homes. Families felt the shift. Husbands and wives woke before dawn to catch buses to factories. Children noticed the tiredness in their parents' eyes. Entire families changed their routines to accommodate night shifts, early shifts, double shifts. Meals were eaten quickly. Sleep was short. But the nation moved with unified purpose. Sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, workers wondered whether their effort truly mattered, whether their long hours, their aching backs, their calloused hands were enough to change the course of a distant war. But when they looked at newspapers, when they heard radio broadcasts about the devastation in Europe, when they read about German confidence, something inside them steadied. They believed, even if they hadn't realized it at first, that they were part of something larger, something necessary. And then America was thrust into war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 did not awaken America's industry. The awakening had already begun. But it accelerated everything, emotionally, psychologically, and operationally. Fear mixed with resolve. Sorrow fused with fury. The nation no longer felt merely challenged, it felt threatened. Suddenly the factories were no longer answering an insult, they were answering an attack. The emotional weight intensified. Workers moved faster, spoke less, focused harder. Foremen demanded more. Engineers redesigned assembly lines in days rather than months. Management expanded operations with breathtaking speed. The nation shifted from rearmament to full-scale war production. And yet, even amid the urgency, the emotional heart of the transformation remained human. Consider the young woman in a California aircraft plant who riveted the wings of B-24 bombers. She had grown up in a small coastal town, had dreamed of being a schoolteacher. The work was brutal, heavy metals, loud machinery, long hours, but she endured it with quiet determination. Each night her hands shook from exhaustion, but each morning she returned. She believed that every rivet she drove into metal brought her brothers, serving overseas, one step closer to survival. Or the engineer in Seattle who designed improvements to the B-17 Flying Fortress. He spent nights hunched over drafting tables, adjusting angles by fractions of degrees. His calculations would save lives in the air, lives he would never meet, names he would never know. Yet his focus rarely broke. The weight of responsibility pressed on him with every stroke of his pencil. Or the foreman in Detroit who had once overseen the production of automobile fenders. Now he managed the assembly of bomber fuselages. He had no aeronautical background, but he learned quickly. He shouted instructions over the roar of machinery, encouraged younger workers, resolved disputes, solved technical problems. He did it not for glory, not for recognition, but because he believed in the ability of his team to meet impossible quotas. These were not heroes in the traditional sense. They carried no weapons. They flew no planes. They held no political power. But they were the backbone of an effort that would reshape the war. It was their hands, steady, skilled, determined, that gave rise to the metal wings that would fill the skies. Still, the transformation was far from smooth. Production bottlenecks plagued early efforts. Factories lacked enough aluminum, enough machine tools, enough trained workers. Supplies ran low. Mistakes cost time and morale. Engines failed tests. Rivets misaligned. Wings warped under stress. Entire batches of parts were scrapped. There were nights when factory lights burned through fog and exhaustion, illuminating workers who felt defeated, overwhelmed, uncertain. There were moments when leaders doubted their own projections. There were periods when it seemed impossible that America could reach the speeds of production required to match Germany. But every setback became fuel. American engineering culture, Improvisational, innovative, competitive, adapted with startling speed. Managers encouraged workers to propose solutions. Engineers revised designs continuously. Factories reorganized assembly lines almost weekly. Mistakes were not signs of failure, but opportunities for improvement. This was something Germany did not understand. German factories were efficient, precise, rigid. But rigidity cracks under pressure. When problems arose, German engineers faced layers of bureaucracy. Solutions required approval. Changes required permission. Innovation required structure. American factories, however, thrived in chaos. They bent, shifted, reworked, reinvented. They were messy, but unstoppable. As 1942 unfolded, the emotional landscape of the nation changed again. What had begun as insult-driven determination had matured into something deeper: unity. Families felt it. Communities felt it. Migrants moving to factory towns felt it. Soldiers overseas wrote home asking for planes, engines, supplies, and their letters inspired workers to push harder. Factories hung maps on walls, marking where each plane they built would serve. Workers gathered around these maps during breaks, tracing routes across oceans and continents. They saw the war not through headlines but through the impact of their labor. This connection, between those who built and those who fought, became the emotional engine of American production. Sometimes in quiet moments between shifts, workers stared at half-built aircraft with a sense of reverence. They imagined pilots climbing into cockpits. They imagined crews navigating storms. They imagined missions in hostile skies. And they realized that the machines they built carried more than metal and fuel. They carried hope, survival, possibility. This understanding gave each rivet more meaning, each weld more weight, each blueprint more urgency. Across the nation, factories continued to expand like living organisms, growing, adapting, multiplying. New plants were built in record time. Existing ones ballooned. Railroads struggled to keep up with the flow of materials. Entire train cars filled with engines, aluminum sheets, landing gear, and fuel pumps crisscrossed the country day and night. Workers rotated in shifts that never stopped. Day shift, swing shift, graveyard shift. The machines rested for no one. And as the months passed, something extraordinary happened. Production numbers began to rise, not slowly but exponentially. Hundreds of aircraft a month became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. Factories that once doubted their own capacity now operated with staggering efficiency. It was a transformation unlike anything industrial history had ever witnessed. Every worker felt it. Every engineer knew it. Every manager watched it unfold with a mixture of disbelief and pride. And soon, so would Germany. But for now, the story remains rooted in the people. The millions of Americans whose hands built the planes that would change the war. They were ordinary yet extraordinary. Flawed yet essential. Tired yet unstoppable. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the factory lights flickered on and another long shift began, they carried with them a simple truth. They were proving the world wrong. By early 1943, the sound of America had changed. The country no longer moved with the patient, hesitant rhythm of a nation climbing out of hardship. Now it pulsed with relentless energy. Machinery thundered across factory floors. Freight trains screamed through the night. Ship horns bellowed in port cities as crates of parts, engines, propellers, landing gear, bomb sites, were loaded for transport. The country vibrated with the mechanical heartbeat of war production. Everywhere there was motion. Everywhere there was noise. Everywhere there was purpose. Yet beneath this booming transformation, tension simmered, not in the factories but in the skies. For even as American production surged, the war was far from won. U.S. pilots flying over Europe faced a brutal enemy. German anti-aircraft guns were precise and deadly. Luftwaffe fighters prowled the clouds with lethal skill. Missions were perilous. Planes were lost. Lives were lost. Each loss sharpened the urgency back home. Factories felt the weight of those losses. Workers noticed when production lists suddenly included increased numbers for replacement planes. They heard rumors from the front, stories of bombers returning with engines shot out, wings torn, fuselages shredded by flak. Some returned limping on a single engine. Others didn't return at all. When messages reached factories that a plane built in their plant had gone down, it hit differently. Workers paused, looked at the floor, took long breaths, and then quietly pushed harder. Every rivet became a form of defiance. Every weld a promise. Every engine a prayer. America's industrial ascent was not just about exceeding Germany's output, it was about keeping American pilots alive. The real conflict now unfolded on two fronts, one in the skies, one on the assembly lines. Each fed the other. Each depended on the other. On the front lines, American airmen faced missions that tested not only machines but human endurance. They flew through icy winds at high altitudes, frost creeping across cockpits. They cradled oxygen masks against their faces to keep consciousness intact. They listened to engines roar and prayed they would not falter. Some carried photos of their families. Some carried small tokens for luck. All carried fear they tried hard not to show. And thousands of miles away, in factories across the American interior, their lives were held in the hands of people who would never meet them. It was an invisible bond, fragile, profound, and deeply human. To German high command, these connections were invisible. They saw only numbers, equipment, logistics. They analyzed American figures and continued to believe that the United States could not sustain its momentum. No nation, they argued, could produce such quantities without sacrificing quality or structure. No democratic society could maintain the discipline required for total war. Their assumptions were validated, or so it seemed, by the appearance of bottlenecks in early 1943. Aluminum shortages slowed production. Railways clogged with freight delays. Components arrived incomplete. Factories faced overwhelming demand. Workers grew exhausted under relentless pressure. Engineers struggled to refine the designs of new aircraft models on impossibly tight schedules. Failures mounted. Entire wings were rejected for flaws in metal stress tests. Engines overheated on test stands. Rivet patterns proved insufficient for high-altitude flight. Raw materials arrived contaminated. Blueprint revisions forced entire assembly lines to halt. For a brief moment, it appeared the German assumption might be correct. But America did not break. It adapted, again. Where Germany relied on rigid structure, America embraced flexibility. Engineers redesigned components within days. Managers reorganized assembly lines overnight. Entire new supply routes were created across the continent. The government intervened where necessary, rerouting resources, reallocating manpower, stabilizing bottlenecks. And at the center of this reorganization was a phenomenon Germany had never truly accounted for: American impatience with failure. The workers didn't accept setbacks as inevitable. They treated them as personal confrontations, direct challenges to their identity, their pride, their promise to the war effort. And so the factories surged forward with renewed determination. Ford's Willow Run plant, once ridiculed for constant delays, became the largest and most efficient bomber factory in the world. Boeing's assembly lines multiplied their output. Douglas aircraft scaled at a pace that stunned industry analysts. General Motors converted entire divisions to aircraft production. Everywhere, production accelerated. Everywhere, workers mastered new skills. Everywhere, managers pushed the limits of what was possible. It was no longer merely a transformation, it was a cultural shift. Yet despite these advances, the emotional pressure inside the factories continued to grow. Workers knew the stakes. They knew that every aircraft that left their line might determine the survival of dozens of airmen. They worked nights, weekends, holidays. Christmas shifts were not unusual. New Year's celebrations happened on factory floors, not in living rooms. Birthdays were celebrated during break time, not at home. Families adjusted. Communities adjusted. The nation adjusted. Still, there came a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when America crossed a threshold that Germany had never imagined possible. Aircraft began to roll off assembly lines faster than the military could deploy them. What had once seemed impossible, absurd even, became real. The numbers climbed in dizzying arcs. 3,000 planes a month. 4,000. Aircraft plants that had once measured success in dozens now counted in hundreds. Those that measured in hundreds now counted in thousands. The sheer scale defied comprehension. And as American production soared, the balance in the skies began to shift. Pilots received newer, more reliable planes. Bombers were repaired faster. Escorts were available in greater numbers. Training aircraft became abundant. Engines improved. Designs evolved. Failures dwindled. Germany noticed the change, though not at first. Initially, Luftwaffe commanders dismissed reports of increased American aircraft presence as anomalies, isolated missions, unusual formations. But as weeks passed, the formations grew larger. Bombing raids intensified. Escort fighters became more numerous, more advanced. Where German pilots once saw isolated squadrons, they now saw waves. Where they once faced manageable threats, they now faced overwhelming force. Where they once controlled the skies, they now shared them with an adversary unlike any they had encountered before. And still the production numbers climbed. Back in America, the emotional landscape shifted again, not toward comfort but toward astonishment. Workers who had once doubted their abilities now watched aircraft roll past them with something akin to awe. They had built these machines. They had created what had once seemed beyond reach. Yet the pressure never disappeared. If anything, it intensified. Quotas rose. Orders expanded. Factories absorbed new workers each week. Men too old for combat, women seeking purpose, migrants seeking opportunity. Entire towns were reshaped by the influx. Housing ran short. Schools overflowed. Hospitals strained. Cafeterias served meals at all hours. Bus routes multiplied. Streets filled with new faces. But the nation endured. And then, quietly, without ceremony, the most extraordinary transformation began to take shape. The year was 1944. American production figures were compiled for internal review. Numbers were tallied, checked, rechecked. Tables were filled. Charts were drawn. The final total emerged. 50,000 planes. In 1 year. A number so large it barely seemed real. When the reports reached the desks of military planners, they paused. Stare. Read them again. Some leaned back in disbelief. Others smiled. A few laughed softly, not out of humor but out of relief. For decades, military theorists had believed such output was impossible. For centuries, wars had been shaped by the slow pace of human labor. But now, in a single year, America had surpassed the combined aircraft production of several nations. The figure rippled through Washington, through the Pentagon, through military bases across the world. Even airmen overseas heard of it, 50,000 planes. It felt as though the skies themselves had shifted. Far away in Germany, the news landed with a different weight. Not disbelief, terror. Luftwaffe commanders, once confident, now faced a nightmare. Their pilots were brave, skilled, disciplined, but exhausted. Their factories, strained by bombings and resource shortages, could not match the American surge. Their fuel supplies dwindled. Their engine factories slowed. Their raw materials vanished. Each month the gap widened. Each month the skies grew darker with American wings. Each month the war tilted. The insult that had once seemed so harmless, so forgettable, now echoed with cruel irony. The Americans? Amateurs? They had answered the insult not with words, but with steel, fire, and 50,000 planes. Back home, the emotional reaction was complex. Workers felt pride, yes. But they also felt exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep fatigue that settles after years of constant effort. Still, beneath the tiredness lay something profound, a sense of purpose fulfilled. Factories celebrated quietly. No parades. No fireworks. Just nods between workers. Handshakes. Brief smiles. They knew what they had achieved. They had built more than machines. They had built the power that would shift the war toward its end. And even though the conflict still raged, even though victory was not yet assured, something fundamental had changed. America had proven not only its industrial might, but its resilience, its adaptability, its unity. The insult had been answered. But the story was not simply about numbers. It was about the humanity behind them, the hands that built the wings, the minds that solved the impossible, the hearts that refused to be underestimated. As the skies filled with American aircraft, the world began to understand a truth that would echo far beyond the war. Never underestimate a nation capable of reinventing itself under pressure. Never underestimate a workforce forged by hardship. Never underestimate a democracy when united by purpose. Never underestimate the quiet determination of millions of ordinary people. For in the year America built 50,000 planes, the world saw not only machines, but the very spirit of a nation rising. As 1944 unfolded, the world stood on the edge of a historic turning point, and few realized just how deeply the roots of this moment stretched, not into military strategy nor political doctrine, but into the quiet, unassuming humanity of ordinary people. The kind of people who never saw themselves as heroes, yet became essential to the survival of nations. When America reached the staggering milestone of 50,000 planes in a single year, the achievement reverberated far beyond the assembly lines. It echoed in the hearts of workers, soldiers, families, even strangers who had watched the war unfold from a distance. It was more than an industrial feat, it was a philosophical revelation, a testament to what human beings can accomplish when driven by unity, necessity, and the stubborn refusal to be underestimated. For in every great moment of history, beneath the numbers and the machinery, there lies something deeply human, the longing to matter, to contribute, to rise beyond the limits others believe define us. And this longing shaped the emotional core of America's transformation. In factories, workers sometimes paused during night shifts to watch snow fall outside, the flakes illuminated by the glow of the industrial lights. They stood in silence for a moment, feeling the cold creep through the factory windows, hearing the constant hum of the assembly lines behind them, and wondered how the war had reshaped their lives. Some thought of loved ones overseas. Some thought of friends lost in early battles. Some wondered what kind of world would emerge when the war finally ended. But most simply thought about the next task, the next rivet, the next weld, the next test. The present moment held them firmly with almost spiritual weight. And as the years rolled on, the emotional burden deepened. There is a particular heaviness that comes from creating weapons, even for a just cause. Workers carried that weight quietly without fanfare or complaint. They knew the machines they built held destructive power. They also knew those machines could prevent greater destruction, could protect lives, could ensure that the world did not fall under the shadow of tyranny. This duality, the coexistence of creation and destruction, echoed in the hearts of everyone involved. It instilled both pride and humility, responsibility and resolve. And as America approached the peak of its industrial expansion, the duality only grew sharper. While factories thrived, letters often arrived from overseas, written by pilots who flew the very planes these workers had built. And those letters, sometimes passed between shifts or posted on bulletin boards, carried a power greater than any production quota. Your plane brought us home. Tell your team they saved our lives today. The engines you built held out all the way back. Some letters were short. Others were heartfelt. A few were written by airmen who would not return from their next mission. When workers read them, the noise of the factory seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by something quieter, more solemn. Gratitude, fear, connection, a sense of being intertwined with lives across oceans and continents. It gave meaning to the exhaustion that had accumulated over years. And it created something profound, the realization that anonymous hands could protect unknown lives. This understanding reshaped the philosophical landscape of the nation. America, once seen by Germany as complacent and soft, had discovered a new identity rooted not in arrogance or aggression, but in responsibility. Workers felt it, soldiers felt it, families felt it. War had forced the country to look inward, to confront its own weaknesses and latent strengths. And in doing so, it awakened a form of collective maturity, as though the nation had crossed an invisible threshold from potential to purpose. Yet amid the pride there was also grief. The war had carved absences, spaces at dinner tables, empty rooms in homes, photographs hung in quiet hallways. Every victory carried the shadow of loss. And every new plane that rolled off the assembly line carried the unspoken hope that it might safeguard someone else's family from feeling the same. Factories occasionally held moments of silence for workers whose sons had been reported missing or killed. Machines stilled. Conversations ceased. The vast, cavernous spaces filled with a silence so deep it seemed to resonate against the steel beams. In that silence, America's emotional core revealed itself. A fragile, trembling mix of sorrow and strength. These were not people driven by hatred, nor by blind nationalism. They were people who had lived through suffering, economic hardship, uncertainty, fear, and who now clung fiercely to the possibility of shaping a better world. The philosophical weight of the transformation became even clearer when contrasted with Germany, whose own factories, strained by bombing and dwindling resources, grappled with entirely different emotions. Fear, desperation, disillusionment. Pilots who once flew with confidence now flew with dread, knowing the skies belonged increasingly to the Allies. Workers in German factories felt the pressure of scarcity. Leaders grew isolated from reality. The arrogance that had once fueled the Reich eroded under the weight of grim pragmatism. Germany had built its war machine on dominance and discipline. America built its on unity and adaptation. In the end, the philosophies shaped the outcomes. Back in the United States, even in the midst of crushing workloads, the emotional landscape carried glimmers of hope, small, quiet, deeply human moments that sustained the nation. Workers saved small pieces of aluminum scraps as keepsakes. Children drew pictures of airplanes to send to soldiers overseas. Communities held simple parades when factories reached production milestones. Musicians visited assembly lines to lift spirits during grueling shifts. Churches prayed for the safety of pilots flying in machines their congregants had built. These seemingly small acts created a subtle but powerful emotional foundation. America was not merely producing machines, it was producing meaning. And as 1944 reached its peak, the philosophical implications deepened further. One of the most profound realizations was this. America had not simply responded to the insult. It had transcended it. The German remark, "They are a nation of amateurs," had once sparked indignation. But by the time the nation reached 50,000 planes, the insult had lost its power. It was not forgotten, but it no longer defined the narrative. America's true motivation now came from something far larger. The desire to secure freedom. The need to protect democracy. The hope of ending a war that had consumed millions of lives. The insult was merely a spark. The flame came from within. And so, as 1944 progressed, the philosophical arc reached its emotional climax. The skies above Europe darkened, not with storm clouds but with squadrons of American aircraft. They flew in formations so vast that German civilians looked upward in stunned silence. Shadows passed over towns, fields, and rivers. The engines rumbled like distant thunder. The war, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Allies. When American pilots flew these missions, many thought of the workers back home. They pictured the hands that had tightened each bolt, tested each engine, aligned each wing. In the cold, thin air above Europe, this connection felt almost spiritual, a reminder that they were not alone. And on the ground, in American factories, workers sometimes paused to imagine where their planes were at that very moment. Somewhere over France? Somewhere over Germany? somewhere defending ships in the Pacific? They wondered whether the plane they had built that week had already taken flight, already protected its crew. This invisible exchange, between builders and fighters, became one of the quiet miracles of the war. And it revealed a philosophical truth that would endure long after the conflict ended. Human strength is greatest not when people act alone, but when they rise together toward a shared purpose. The war had forced America to confront itself, its doubts, its fears, its potential. And through the crucible of that struggle, the nation discovered capacities it had never imagined. It learned that ordinary people, united by necessity, could build the extraordinary. It learned that humility could coexist with power. It learned that democracy, though slow, could ignite with unstoppable momentum. It learned that unity was not a gift, it was a choice. And perhaps most importantly, it learned that the greatest transformations begin not with certainty, but with challenge. A nation once mocked as amateur had become the world's greatest industrial force. A people once hesitant had become resolute. A workforce once scarred by hardship had become a symbol of resilience. The philosophical arc of America's rise was not merely a story of machines, but a story of human nature, how people respond when pushed, underestimated, challenged, or threatened. Some crumble. Some retreat. Some break. But some, like the millions of Americans who built 50,000 planes, rise. Quietly. Steadily. Relentlessly. The war would soon move toward its final chapters. Victory approached. The skies had shifted. The tides had turned. But before closure could come, something deeper had to be understood. Something that connected past to future, conflict to peace, destruction to creation. In the end, the greatest legacy of America's industrial surge was not the planes themselves, nor the numbers, nor even the victory they helped secure. The greatest legacy was the revelation of what human beings are capable of when united by purpose, and what nations can become when they refuse to accept the limits others impose on them. The insult had sparked a transformation. The transformation had shaped a new future. And now, as the war neared its end, the deeper meaning of that transformation began to crystallize. A meaning that would echo long after the guns fell silent. A meaning that would define generations. A meaning that still resonates today. By the final months of the war, the world had changed in ways that few could have foreseen. Cities lay in ruins across Europe. Borders were redrawn by force. Entire nations had endured loss so profound that even victory carried the weight of sorrow. And yet, despite the destruction, something extraordinary had emerged. A demonstration of human resolve unlike anything the modern world had witnessed. America's industrial surge had become one of the defining forces behind that change. Not because it overwhelmed Germany by sheer numbers alone, but because it revealed what unity can accomplish when individuals believe their labor carries purpose. The year the United States built 50,000 planes was not simply a chapter in a war story, it was a testament to the capacity of a nation to transform itself from within. As 1945 dawned, the skies belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Vast formations of American bombers and fighters flew missions with a confidence that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. The roar of their engines became the soundtrack of a world on the brink of liberation, and the symbol of a nation that had risen to meet a challenge it never sought but accepted with determination. The Luftwaffe, once feared and nearly unstoppable, struggled under the weight of losses and shortages. German pilots flew against impossible odds. Fuel was scarce. Replacement aircraft were few. Factories had been bombed repeatedly. The air superiority that once defined the Reich had slipped irreversibly away. The tide had turned completely. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of government offices, military planners revisited the German remark that had, in its own small way, helped ignite the American transformation. They remembered how confidently Germany had dismissed the United States. How certain they were that the Americans lacked discipline, resolve, skill, and unity. How their arrogance had hidden from them the reality simmering beneath the surface of a restless nation. Perhaps the irony was too painful to acknowledge publicly. But privately, officials understood how differently events had unfolded from what Germany had predicted. The insult, spoken almost casually, had collided with a spirit Germany never truly understood. A spirit forged not in conquest but in resilience. Not in domination but in imagination. Not in certainty, but in the unglamorous, stubborn belief that people could rise when needed. And so, as the final months of the war unfolded, America stood at a crossroads, not with fear but with reflection. In factories that had once roared with activity, shifts began to slow. Workers found themselves listening to quieter machines, to shorter lines, to fewer urgent announcements crackling through loudspeakers. The endless pressure, quotas, deadlines, revisions, shortages, began to ease. Some workers felt relief. Others felt uncertainty. Most felt a complex mix of both. For years their lives had been defined by purpose. They had woken each day knowing what had to be done, knowing that every task mattered. As the war drew closer to its end, many wondered what came after purpose. What was the meaning of life when the factories stopped shouting their needs every hour? When the world no longer depended on their hands? Some feared losing their jobs. Others feared losing their identity. But deep down, many understood that they had given the world something irreplaceable: the power to end a war that had threatened everything. As Germany collapsed under the pressure of the Allied advance, soldiers on the ground and pilots in the air spoke of the overwhelming force that supported them from behind, the endless arrival of planes, supplies, engines, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. It became clear to them that the war was not only being fought overseas, but also in the hearts and hands of those who worked in the factories back home. The connection between the battlefield and the assembly line became undeniable. Pilots, walking across runways to their aircraft, often patted the fuselage before climbing aboard, as though thanking the unknown workers who had crafted the machine. Some scribbled notes to their families about how the plane handled beautifully today, or the engine never faltered, or you can tell the folks back home know what they're doing. And back in America, workers read newspapers reporting the progress of the war. They recognized the names of planes they had built. They followed the stories of squadrons flying missions across Europe and the Pacific. Some workers traced routes on maps pinned up in break rooms, following the progress of aircraft that had once passed through their hands. There was pride in those moments, quiet, steady pride, but also humility, because each person understood that their contribution, while vital, was part of a much larger whole. Victory was never the result of any single hand or single factory. It was a mosaic of millions of efforts, each imperfect, each limited, each essential. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, celebrations erupted across the United States. Cities lit up with parades, fireworks, and cheers. Streets filled with joyful crowds. Church bells rang for hours. Radios crackled with announcements. Newspapers printed extra editions, selling out within minutes. But inside many factories, the atmosphere was strangely different. Workers gathered silently around radios placed on crates or hung from rafters. When the news came through, some smiled. Some laughed. Some cried. A few simply nodded and returned to their tasks, finishing the shift with quiet grace. For them, the moment of victory was deeply personal, yet felt almost surreal. They had lived through the war in a way few civilians in history had, working day after day, night after night, shaping the machines that had safeguarded a generation. As the celebrations drifted into the night, many workers walked home under the glow of street lamps, hearing the echoes of crowds in the distance. The air felt lighter, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in years, the nation exhaled. But in that long exhale came reflection. What had the nation become during these years of transformation? What had it learned about itself? What had it proven to the world, and to its own people? The answers were not simple. America had gained immense industrial power, but it had also discovered the weight of responsibility that comes with such power. It had unleashed a new kind of strength, one that future generations would struggle to define. Strength built on unity, sacrifice, innovation, and human perseverance. It had also uncovered profound truths about democracy, truths that Germany had failed to understand. That freedom can be a source of discipline. That open debate can lead to better solutions than rigid control. That creativity thrives when people feel trusted. That courage emerges not only in battle, but in the quiet moments of daily work. That unity does not require coercion, only purpose. These lessons shaped not only the war but the world that followed. In the decades after the conflict, historians would write about the industrial miracle of the 1940s. Economists would analyze the manufacturing techniques that emerged. Politicians would debate the policies that guided the transformation. Journalists would interview workers whose lives were forever changed. But numbers, charts, and reports could never capture the true essence of what had happened. Because the story of America's rise to build 50,000 planes in a single year was not a story of machines. It was a story of people. People who woke before dawn, worked through exhaustion, learned unfamiliar trades, solved impossible problems, raised families, endured grief, and held on to hope. People who believed that their labor could protect lives on the other side of the world. People who refused to accept limitations placed on them by distant, arrogant voices. People who understood that history does not belong to the powerful alone. It belongs to those who build its foundations. And so, as the war ended and factories slowed, the emotional heart of the nation shifted once more, from urgency to reflection. Workers went home. Machines were cleaned and shut down. Assembly lines paused. Blueprints were archived. Tools were stored. But something profound lingered in the quiet that followed. A recognition of what unity could accomplish. A memory of what it felt like to rise together. A reminder that the strength of a nation lives not in its weapons, but in the will of its people. The insult that had once sparked the transformation faded into history, overshadowed by the scale of what followed. It remained a footnote, a small, careless remark that had awakened something far larger than its speaker could ever have imagined. If there was any lasting meaning in that moment, it was not bitterness. It was clarity. Never underestimate a society forged in struggle. Never underestimate a workforce shaped by resilience. Never underestimate a democracy united by purpose. Never underestimate the quiet determination of millions of ordinary hands. For America had proven something timeless, something that extends far beyond the war, beyond the century, even beyond national borders. That the greatest power in human history is not the ability to destroy, but the capacity to create, to build, to adapt, to rise when challenged, to unite when needed, to believe that the future can be shaped through effort and courage. As the decades passed, the roar of wartime factories faded into memory. But the legacy of that era, of that monumental year, remains etched in the fabric of history. It is there in every innovation that followed. In every moment when nations confront crisis. In every story of ordinary people accomplishing the extraordinary. In every reminder that unity can transform the impossible into the inevitable. And so, as the final words of this story drift into the quiet, we are left with a truth as enduring as the history that inspired it. A single insult may ignite the spark. But it is humanity, resilient, creative, united, that carries the flame.